Bill. So greetings and a warm welcome to everyone joining us for this evening's Spotlight with visual artist Karen Kitchel and art writer Leah Ollman. I'm thrilled to be introducing this program as I know both of these brilliant women personally, and I'm certain you'll find their conversation engrossing. I met Karen Kitchel at Ucross 18 years ago and have followed her work as a friend and fan since then. Karen's environmentally resonant works embody a deep, lifelong commitment to extend our definition of landscape painting. I also think that she's up to a lot more than landscape painting in her current body of work, which you'll see when we visit her studio. Karen's paintings and installations have been featured in exhibitions throughout the country and are in private and public collections worldwide, including the permanent collections of the Denver Art Museum, the Palm Springs Art Museum, the Tucson Museum of Art, the Joslin Art Museum, the Buffalo Bill Center of the West, the National Museum of Poland, the US State Department, and the New York headquarters of Pfizer, among others. Karen lives and works in Ventura, California, and is represented by Robuchon Gallery of Denver and Gerald Peters Gallery of Santa Fe and New York. We're happy and proud that she's also a member of Ucross's National Advisory Council. So welcome, Karen, and it's really great to see you.
Thanks. Thanks to everybody. Wonderful to be with you tonight.
Thank you. So our moderator for the evening's program, Leah Ollman, writes about the visual arts for the Los Angeles Times, Art in America, and numerous other publications. We're very proud that Leah is also a Ucross alum. Her books and exhibition catalogs include Alison Rossiter, Expired Paper, William Kentridge, Weighing and Wanting, the photographs of John Brill, Michael Chelbin, Strangely Familiar, and Camera as Weapon, Worker Photography Between the Wars. So hi, Leah, and thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Hi, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. So before turning the conversation over to Leah and Karen, we're going to play a short video that will give you just a glimpse of Karen's painting over many years. It provides some foundation for understanding the environmental concerns that remain the heart and soul of her work as an artist. So Bill, we're ready for that video.
I've made good progress over the decades, taking apart the landscape, disassembling whatever landscape I'm exploring, and putting it back together in ways that are revealing things about the landscape in question, raising questions, inviting viewers into the conversation with me. So I've been doing that with the image, but now at this point in my practice, I feel like I'm making exciting headway with the materials as well. So just like I've specifically rejected the neutrality of the window into the picture plane or into the space, I'm more aware of dismissing neutrality of the materials, like why oil paint? Now it's why oil? You know, I'm using the materials of the conversation. The burlap is associated with the tragedy of fire, with the local industry of agriculture, with a humble material that I'm either going to let show or hide. So even though there's more diversity in some of the finished objects than there had been before, to me, the materials are connecting to each other and to a certain kind of investigation. So that feels good. That feels like I'm getting closer to the core.
So with that, Leah, I'm going to turn it over to you and Karen for the first part of our conversation.
Terrific. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Bill. Karen and I have crossed paths without actually meeting at several points in our lives. I was an undergraduate at Scripps College when she was in graduate school at Claremont Graduate University. But it took Ucross to finally get us in the same place, in the same conversation. So I'm very grateful. I know in the hour or less that we have to talk, we won't be able to do justice to your work over nearly 40 years. So I wanted to focus on some through lines that make all of your work yours. And the first, most obvious one is that from the start, you've painted the landscape. And as you said in the video clip, you're taking the landscape apart. You're taking the conventions of landscape painting apart. I wanted to know, what are those pictorial conventions that dictate landscape painting, and how and why are you aiming to subvert them?
You're starting with my favorite question, Leah. Good.
Excellent.
The journey probably started when I was a young transplant in art school, coming from Michigan to California. And I was seeing landscapes that were very unfamiliar, very manicured, very planned. Obviously, I had seen residential landscapes and human arranged landscapes before, but never at the scale that Southern California has to offer. As I became more academically and intellectually interested in landscape and trying to understand the parameters, I embarked on a self-study that hasn't ended, trying to understand the genre and the conventions that I've inherited. As a contemporary artist, one that's had a lot of conceptual and political training, finding myself emotionally and intellectually drawn to landscape was kind of horrifying at first. It's a very underappreciated genre in our time in terms of what it can be and what it can communicate. And I think that that difficulty to a huge extent is due to the burden of the tropes and the conventions that have come down to us over the not just decades, but centuries. Any art history students out there probably are very aware that during the Renaissance times, landscape was pretty much at the bottom of the hierarchy of the important subjects for painting. History painting, portrait painting, all those many other approaches to visual arts were way above landscape. I think landscape and still life were tied for the bottom pretty much, and in a lot of ways that remains so today. So for me, the key to unlocking what my voice would be, what my contributions could be, we're trying to understand this recipe, this confining, suffocating recipe. So things that are in conventional landscapes, or the recipe, as I like to disparagingly call it, the horizon line, the big view, the distant view. It's really important that that nature and the landscape be out there. The farther, the better, but it can't be right here. It needs to be clean, needs to be orderly. It can have animals, but the animals should be harmless and possibly far away. Clouds, weather, plants, lighting is best if it's golden and soft, or if you're Turner, it can be, turgid and violent. But there's a lot of generic qualities to landscape painting as it's come down to us. But the more I read about it and the more I read about it today, the generic quality of landscape painting, as I felt burdened by it, wasn't necessarily true, but it's our contemporary seizure of the conventions, because it really makes us feel good, especially in today's time, to have some kind of a tonic, some kind of a land that continues with vigor and beauty in spite of all the horrifying things our species has done and is doing to it. So it's kind of a bottomless challenge to unpack that, but it gives me a lot of material, and the material that gives me ideas comes everything from a newspaper article to stepping in tar at my local beach. So the motivation's everywhere, but it's the history of what we expect from it that informs me and keeps the ideas ticking.
Wonderful. When you went to graduate school, when you first came to California, it was the early 80s, and theory and conceptualism were pretty dominant. You jokingly recalled to me that there were some artists at CGU who didn't even have any art making materials in their studio. So I know that kind of education clearly had some residue in your work, and it extends through your work, some of that conceptual thinking. I was wondering if you could talk a little about that, and hearing you describe the pictorial conventions of landscape painting, of having to do a lot with escape and solace, makes me think that those were exactly what conceptual artists were rejecting. The art as should be something provocative and stimulating and challenging, rather than a reprieve and Matisse's cozy armchair.
Right. And I would go further and say the conceptual biases of that time were primarily aimed at the laziness of artists that were recycling conventions, not examining them.
Mhm.
So by taking them apart, I feel I was able to dodge that, but it was a long learning curve. At that time, there were fears of not just physical materials, but beauty itself. You may remember all the many articles that were written in the 80s about the death of beauty, the resurgence of beauty, the threat, the danger of beauty. It was definitely not to be trusted. So I ended up dealing with a very contemporary topic, but using very subversive and beautiful tools. That idea of subversion, of taking what's expected and turning it inside out, I also got from Claremont, but not in a way they were maybe anticipating. I worked closely when I was in graduate school with one of the preeminent feminist artists of that decade, Faith Wilding, and we discussed, and still discuss today, about the power of working from the inside, of taking a comfortable chair and giving it nails in the cushions, and that there's a lot to be gained from understanding the tools and understanding the biases against those tools as well. So it's really not an exaggeration to say people didn't have art supplies. I went from an undergraduate school that was very academically rigorous and had, kind of I can't come up with the right word. It was just like an honorary art department. It wasn't a vigorous art department. And then I went to a vigorous art department where nothing was really specifically defined. The encouragement was just one of chaos and conflict. So that's definitely informed where I come from, and still how I try out ideas today, I think.
Thank you for bringing up beauty. I want to talk a little more about beauty, because it's so easy to misunderstand. By definition, beauty is appealing. It invites you in, but and it obviously is it opens a door for viewers, but it can also act like a trap door, in the sense that it can distract you from deeper complications and dangers, maybe weightier issues. I wanted to hear from you about what your sense of beauty is, because your work is, in addition to everything else, it's beautiful. And how do you use beauty to broaden the dialogue about more complicated realities?
Well, in addition to it being a door and a trap door, beauty is also a construction. And that's been an eye opener for me to, again, ask those same kinds of questions. Beautiful to whom? Through what eyes? What time? How informed or uninformed is that beholder? A very early exhibition I was in, I can remember a very distraught member of the audience directing a question at me very aggressively at the end, but what about beauty? And of course, fresh out of Claremont, I thought, well, truth is beauty. Struggle is beauty. Achieving knowledge is beauty. So all of those things matter to me a great deal. And in terms of beautiful of the physical, I've always said very seriously that, they do call it visual art. So I intend to use all the visual weapons. And I sat straight up when they said the name of your book, photography as a weapon. I mean, all these things can be used as sedatives, as stimulants, as rewards, as lures. I mean, it's kind of fascinating to consider the many different ways all of these elements, even the dismissed tools, how they can function. So I'm all in on beauty, but I might withhold it from you in a way that you are expecting. I try to not use it to hypnotize, but instead to get you to come in a little closer.
Using the seductive power to.
It's a skill. It's a skill. I spent a long time in my formal studies being scolded for skills that I have, natural skills, skills of hand-eye, skills of scientific inquisitiveness, ability, interest in talking, in reading. And I think I've successfully shed most of those concerns. And I'm trying to use all my natural born skills and the ones I've studied as effective tools now.
It's a very full toolbox.
Thank you for saying that.
Before we started our in-person conversation, and we had a little conversation by email, you sent me a great list of readings that had been formative for you over the years. And one of them was a terrific essay by Rebecca Solnit. And I wanted to refer to something that she wrote in this great essay about the conventions of landscape representation. And she was more specifically talking about photography, but I think the points pertain to painting as well. And she writes about the categories of rapture and outrage, and how conventionally there's no confusion between the two, but that in the last 50 or 60 years or so, especially in photography, there have been artists who have managed to compress a sense of rapture and a sense of outrage, and we're talking about around the natural world, within a single frame. Maybe she talks about John Fall and a number of others.
I know she loves Mizrak.
And Mizrak, yes, Richard Mizrak, that's who I was thinking of. So I wanted to ask you, how do you relate to that, that kind of binary of rapture and outrage? Are there artists that you can point to who have struck a fine balance, not necessarily a balance, but who have managed to negotiate both of those in ways that inspire you?
Oh, I'll answer the question, but then I must circle back to talking about Solnit's essay, because I have it here in front of me. It's definitely one of my core scriptures. Probably an early inspiration for me, a photographer that I discovered while I was in Claremont, and then got to know much, much better over the years, photographer Robert Adams. I'm sorry, I don't have a still to show you right here, but very well known as one of the group of photographers that really took an unromantic, very clear-eyed look at the natural world and did not define landscape or nature as unpopulated. Some of Adams' photos, often done in silver print or silver gelatin, have a really cold eye. You can't really call it judgmental or sympathetic, but they're certainly not nostalgic or romantic of a parking lot, of a subdivision, by typical landscape genre standards. If a painter does that, shows that lens on those subjects, were considered, troublesome, environmental, aggressive, provocative. But God bless Adams, he made it look normal, expected, very professional, and very beautiful. So he is a big voice in my head a lot of the time. Regarding the essay you're quoting from Sonnet, some of you out there might find it interesting. It's called Uplift and Separate: The Aesthetics of Nature Calendars, where she basically draws equivalencies between pinup soft porn and the Sierra Club and other facsimiles of beautiful nature in calendars. And she talks about that very eloquently as a preference in both female aesthetic and nature's aesthetic, as a preference for virginal, airbrushed, uncomplicated, passive forms of beauty. And that had a huge impact on me, but she didn't come out with that essay until '97. She impacted me much, much earlier than that, in the early '80s, when I was first exhibiting. She was writing for a weekly print paper coming out of Northern California, and I still have that article where she dismissed landscape painting, not landscape photography, landscape painting, as a place, quote, where curators and artists go for summer vacation, when they need to rest their brains. I thought, oh, I took that challenge up and tucked it in my heart, and I've never let it go, because I knew I was striving toward something much more serious than that. But it hit me, with the ferocity of how big the problem was and is, and how it's specific to painters. I think that the weight of the sexiness, of the beautiful seduction of the materials adds pressure, adds extra pressure. It's very difficult to have our intentions be seen. There's a lot of translation going on in the heads of the audience. So even if I show you something pretty truthful, our own filters, our own preferences, our own yearning back to Arcadia, I think, kind of greenwash those images and put it back, how it's supposed to look. So the sharp-eyed, totally almost heartless vision of people like Robert Adams really kept me going straight. And Rebecca's always a good reminder how much work there's left to do.
Absolutely. And I love your connection with Robert Adams. And I think he actually ties into that binary of rapture and outrage, in a sense, because I have found Robert Adams to be a photographer of ambivalence. And most people think of ambivalence as apathy, but ambivalence is feeling both things, is feeling both two ways about something. And I think he very powerfully manages to show the beauty and the rapture of the Western landscape and the horror of what's been done to it.
Almost without comment. I mean, obviously, where any artist points their gaze reveals bias, point of view, history, knowledge, experience, all of those things. Yet he does it with a minimal fuss. He keeps the true pain or the true joy very close to the vest. And I find that very interesting professionally, aesthetically, because, you know, now that I've become more acquainted with his writing and know more about his stated points of view, no, he's not ambivalent and he's not even neutral, but he's existing as a very thorough, very high quality reporter in the truest sense, and that he's offering a mirror. And we can either bear it or we can't. And that's where our own history and biases come in.
He has the tool of photography, which is considered so transparent, as a weapon in his favor. But as you said, with painting, there's so much seduction in the material itself that you have a harder task, maybe. I want to talk about materials with you, and I think maybe this is a good time to go to that second video where you do talk a little bit about finish and materials, and we get a better view of some of your new work.
Okay, let's look.
I think what I do is play an undisclosed game with myself about areas of finish that will persuade you to go into the painting with me. Mm-hmm. And so that's a very interesting question. It's harder to see myself doing it on the little paintings, but on the bigger ones, it's become more obvious that, well, if I give everything an equal finish or an equal degree of gloss or something, it's going to be less interesting than if there's entry points and blockade points, and that's, you know, that's an answer that someone who isn't used to looking at art or isn't used to painting may have no idea what I'm talking about. But it's physical points of entry, and it's also visual, and it just makes it more pleasing to my judgment to not have things be exactly the same. The group of the corn stalks, which are adding up to be a cornfield, I started pre-pandemic, and then me and the ladder, I turned all my attention to the Three Sisters. That was on deadline, but then those deadlines got set aside. So when I was done with the garden piece, then I picked this up again. So I've been working on these for more than a year as well. And the exciting thing and the challenging thing for me is that all of them are coming in and out of finish all at the same time. Like if they're still in this room, they're still being worked on. I've tried finishing something in a group separately, then literally turning it around or taking it out, and then somehow it doesn't belong any longer. So I prefer to keep all the paintings in flux until the hammer drops, until the deadline comes, until I create or discover that balance, that harmony. And that's the part that's beyond words. So I'm going from, brushes like this in the early phases of the panels to intermediate brushes, and then finally giving some real specific focus here and there to make certain areas more noticeable, sharper. It's too bad I'm not at the point where I get out, I'm going to get out the big brushes again and splash some sheer washes of color over this, but I'm not quite at that spot. Things have to be really, really dry when I do that. Nice. So I've been looking at landscapes of all type for a long time. The piece behind me is made on burlap bags, bags that are used for storing feed, for stabilizing hillsides as sandbags, and the image is things from my own garden. This is the group from the New World Garden, the Three Sisters. My idea was to make something monumental, to make something where nature's personality and voice is strong. Location isn't necessarily specific, but it is a garden of some sort. What's growing, what's happening, what comes next, we have to look closer.
You're very much a problem solver, which is something you take pride in, with the scientific a scientific bent. But one of the things I was quite delighted to hear you describe yourself as really as a problem welcomer. And you create obstacles for yourself materially and probably otherwise.
No, I do not.
That you then put yourself in a position to overcome. For instance, the Three Sisters, the huge painting on burlap, it posed some very challenging material problems. Could you give us some examples of material challenges that you've set for yourself and what you've done to overcome them?
Since we just saw the Three Sisters, I'll start with them. I had received an enormous stack of these sandbags. I think I was mostly taken with the color and the embroidered edges. So these throwaway objects associated with either hard labor or disaster had really fancy, extra nice overstitching, and it was green. So I thought, okay, I got to do something with that. But they sat around for a while before I started. And of course, the pandemic offered the perfect opportunity of excess time,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of privacy, more than usual. I thought I knew a lot about surfaces, but burlap is a tough one in that it's endlessly absorbent. And for the last 30 years, I've been painting in oils, although I do have some pretty deep background in acrylic and latex and other things. So I threw everything at that piece. First, I had to sew it all together. I tried the sewing machine, but I'm not what you would call a polished seamstress, and everything just kept bunching up. So I ended up doing hand stitching with string, and that was kind of good. It was during the last few years of stabbing was a good daily activity for a lot of the news cycle. And then I had to figure out how to secure the surface so that some of the paint would last. So yeah, there are a lot of experiments on the Three Sisters that include stabilizing the front, attempts at stabilizing the back. There's everything on there: charcoal, acrylic paint, oil paint, powdered pigments, gallons of Roplex. And in the end, it's still going to be pretty flexible because it will have to be moved in sections. So that big piece, which is over 16 feet wide, is actually constructed out of tall vertical strips that I can roll up on sonotubes. So when that goes to the exhibit in Claremont this fall, I'll just roll it up. And that was another thing I had to solve. How do you roll something so that you don't get damage or cracking? how do I make something this big so I don't have to spend $5,000 on a crate that's that size? And I don't think I go looking for problems, Leah, but there are a lot of problems out there. And I would prefer to win a few rounds than just always go for the easy exit. So that's what my attitude. That's what I'm trying.
You said something wonderful when we spoke in your studio about liking to see the struggle, liking to see when you're looking at art, you like to see signs of that struggle. And I think while you mention all the challenges in Three Sisters with the burlap, the smaller pieces we looked at where you're mixing oil and water and different pigments maybe get at some of that more visible struggle. I don't know if we have any stills of those.
Of the asphalt pieces.
Yes. I don't think we do. But maybe you can talk a little about what's happening with those where you are creating some challenges for yourself materially.
Yeah, I think thinking back to the conversation that we had about struggle and resolution, that was a question I was asked one time about how I function as a juror and how my standards and judgments as a juror overlap with my own studio practice. And I think I'm always expecting a struggle in the studio, and I'm always looking for struggle in other artworks from other people because it gives me some clues into the depth, height, and location of the challenges you've set for yourself or I've set for myself. So it can look a number of ways, of course, but I want to see footprints of the struggle, but then of course the piece needs to look resolved. It doesn't mean all the struggle has to be hidden, and it also doesn't mean it has to be bleeding from both wrists, but both are true and both are interesting. And there's something about how the struggle and the resolution find a common ground, even if just for a few moments or in a certain area, are really exciting visually to me and intellectually. It gives me places to direct questions, and it gives me a dialogue in which to critique my own work so that I'm not expecting a limited kind of perfection. I'm always letting my mind wander, letting my eyes wander, looking for something that's going to have a surprising resolution.
I do want to ask you one more question about materials and about some of the materials you use that are dark and sticky, are things that you've harvested on the beach and in ditches in your area where you live. They make fascinating materials. They make for a really rich tactile surface. There's also this great question you're raising about not a question, but an equation of the literal material being used, a material being used literally to represent itself, using a petroleum product to represent a landscape that is used to extract petroleum. And we talked a little bit about this literality question, and I was wondering if you could talk just a little bit about that.
This is a fresh avenue of articulation, so bear with me, but it's one that's currently got my full attention. As a painter who's to a great degree self-taught, I have been in both investigating, haunted, rewarded by all the challenges, expectations, and biases regarding realism in painting. That's a fraught, deep topic for any artists out there, collectors, art historians. You know what I'm talking about. There are expectations, there are standards, and there are dismissals about what that means to be a realist. But since that's in part of my skill set, I think about realism a lot, not just as a truthful representation of a picture, but also in terms of authenticity, literality, representation versus actual, all of these things. And so to step in tar and then collect it and use it to make a paint substance, other artists have just spread it on a panel and called it done. But I found it an interesting intellectual and verbal game to use the material to show itself where I find it as well. So I'm taking apart again things that are in the painting, how big is the painting, and now what the painting's made out of. So a lot of this has to do with my career-long, I think, struggle about the frame. You know, what is a frame? What is my frame? And now it's turning into questions of scale and construction. And all those things are just building on each other into a taller and taller house of questions. And you know, I don't know how long the asphalt will keep my attention, but it's a beautiful material, and it's mixing with soil and earth and mineral pigments and other things that are also more obviously themselves. Now, traditional oil paints or watercolors, any paints really, pigments are obviously from the earth. Now we have artificially made pigments as well. But when I use things like tar and dirt and jars of iron ore, things like that, I feel like I'm making some steps further in my personal search to let the materials kind of be themselves a little bit louder, with less disguise, with less camouflage. And that's part of what you and I had talked about the neutrality. So I'm trying to shed more and more layers of neutrality so that this art zone, we're all supposed to agree to the same masquerade, you know, that paint isn't really paint, the frame isn't really a frame, you know. And so I'm just trying to get down in it, you know, find out what these things are in a more rough and ready way.
I'm so glad you brought up neutrality. That's exactly what I was going to ask you as you were talking about the materials, because it's it's so charged to use that kind of material to make images, and especially to remake the landscape that, as you said early on, is so often dismissed and in a way made invisible. Do we have a few more minutes to talk about the cornstalk paintings, or? Okay.
Yes.
All right. I wanted to ask you, Karen, about your thoughts as you were painting these incredible vertical representations of these dead cornstalks. You mentioned something when I was in your studio about how you were thinking about America, and here you are in semi-isolation, painting these dead cornstalks that might have something to do with climate change, drought, might be emblematic or metaphoric of any number of things. Can you talk a little about what continues to go through your head as you work on that series?
I can, but should I? I will. The first level of meaning, probably I can go back and pin it on sonnet, because one of the things that is supposed to be absent from landscape paintings is decay death, change, anything that's untidy or not vibrant and inspiring. So they were born, the cornstalk paintings were born out of a garden fail on my own hillside, my own slope garden. Apparently I'm not a very good corn farmer, but knowing that corn is one of the biggest specimens of grass, I thought, well, I might as well pile them up in the studio and see if the muse ever calls. And she did. So in addition to the feelings of isolation and the disappointment of being a bad corn farmer, it isn't lost on me that corn is the #1 commercial crop in the United States. I think it's the #3 crop in the world. It's one of our biggest exports. It receives massive subsidies from the government to farmers to either grow it or not grow it. It's in almost everything we eat, drink, or use. So it seemed a uniquely American icon. And I had been working with other vertical subjects. So, and I really find it exciting. I like the human engagement, the body referential size. So I decided to continue with that. And it also meets my apparently lifelong standard of taking apart a group, breaking it down into units, examining it, and then reassembling it as a group. So even though this group of work is a great example of how I approach landscape as a natural scientist, specimen collector, or as even a still life artist, when they're reassembled, it reconvenes and re-exists as a landscape. Yeah, and you are intuitive, Leah. The time in which it was made, and although I'm finishing them now, America has gone through some changes, and it seems a very fitting contemporary portrait of who we are now, what we are now, challenges of feeding our own population, let alone the world, waste, death, decay, the whole thing. And if we're lucky, a regeneration at some point. Although the way commercial seed is made and distributed now, of course, many of these plants are designed to be sterile and to die a permanent death when they die. So a lot of questions. I'm not all there with you on the answers yet, but I'm keeping notes.
And the series is still in progress. So.
Absolutely. It was a pretty fresh weekend to have you and the film guys come in and see it. So thanks for the feedback and the first look.
Yeah, it was a pure pleasure. I think we're running low on time, but I have one more question that's really a two-part question, of course, which is my favorite interview question of all times.
Oh no.
What haven't I asked you that you would like to address? Which really means what doesn't get talked about enough in your work that you would like to bring to the fore?
Oh, I forgive you. It's a good question. Thank you. I would say the question deals with maybe place or lack of place in my work. Another thing that traditional landscape usually demands is an identifiable location or site, landmarks, and that distance that's so typical of a landscape painting lets us as the viewers situate it out there at a safe distance or at a distance where we can dominate. You know, we can see it, control it, dismiss it, or enter. So I think what I'm starting to approach more than ever in these bigger, sloppier works is a more full dissolution of location, that the specimens are specific and accurate, they're scientific, they're botanically real, but the location is literally dissolved. The location is with you, with me. I think I'm getting closer to putting an idea in the beholder's mind that, you know, I am with this field. I am with this weed. It's my story. It's not the thing out there, the place over there, the nature that's clean and protected in the park, or the ugly factory in that photograph. It's really mine. It's my story. It's my accountability. It's with me. So I think that's where I'm moving. And that's a difficult thing to talk about. And it's definitely a new thing to talk about, I believe, in terms of landscape.
No, I think that's a great place to stop. But I don't know if anyone's submitted any questions.
I haven't seen any questions in the chat, but I do wonder for the couple minutes remaining here if Karen or both of you actually would want to talk about your Ucross experience and as part of the process and evolution of your career.
Do you want to fly first, Leah?
Sure. I've only been to Ucross once, hoping to correct that soon.
Mhm.
But it was in 2013. I was there in a very cold late winter, and it was spectacularly expansive in both place and experience. It was just an opportunity to really dig into some work, to meet some extraordinary people, and explore an otherworldly landscape. I'm still in disbelief that the place exists.
It is a pretty wonderful piece of space. It's more than land. It's definitely space. I've been there a few times as a resident, and many, many other times for meetings. My favorite place and time is in the mud season, sometime between the dead of winter and when things are completely thawed. I love seeing the bare bones of the landscape when everything is Payne's gray and raw umber, maybe a dusting of snow. Exploring the paths of the water and the tracks of the animals and all that dormant, bent grass. I have made many, many paintings that I'm in debt to Ucross for. All those rhythms of seeing the rhythms of land, you know, both what is alive now, what was alive last season. The patterns are incredible. I'm a pretty prolific artist anyway, but there is nothing like having somebody bring you dinner and lunch, let me tell you. It's amazing how much more you can get done when honored with the opportunity to never even have to take care of yourself, really. It's nurturing in the best possible sense. So any artists that are listening who have never investigated, it's worth it. I never thought I was a residency type of artist because I am so comfortable with my own solitude, but it's a very non-interfering place. There's a lot of oxygen and a lot of oxygen infusion that happens when you're there. So I'm forever grateful as well.
Well, thank you both. That was a truly wonderful discussion, and we're very lucky to have you here tonight. I just want to, I will echo that thought. If there are any artists on the Zoom here who are contemplating applying, please apply to Ucross, to Ucross, and come to ucross.org to learn more. And I hope everyone here will continue to support artists support the creation of new work, and support Ucross. I do want to thank our sponsors who make these Ucross Spotlight events possible, as well as the Ucross Board of Trustees, who gives us the freedom to do this. So thanks to both of them. We have one more spotlight event in our spring season. That's June 10th. So mark your calendars for that. That will be a celebration of Ucross's partnership with the Penn Hemingway Award for Debut Fiction. And yeah, that will feature Joshua Ferris, Tessa Mashvig, and a special message from, I believe, the Hemingway family. So, keep your calendar open for that. So some final words. I'm going to pass it back to Steve here to close up.
Great, Bill. Thank you. Really don't have much more to say. I just really would like to again thank Leah and thank Karen for a really wonderful program. And Bill, I think you mentioned that it's available on Facebook and it's on YouTube, et cetera. So, and I'm sure you can get a link and spread it to friends. But the main thing I wanted to say is just how wonderful it is to have this community, to have the Ucross community, that somehow this space in a remote part of Wyoming has just generated so many relationships and over many years. So it's just really, it's a privilege and a great joy to be part of this community. So thank you to everyone who participated tonight, who watched, and everyone have a good evening. Until the next time.
All right. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.